I went into the service in August of 1940. And then in 1941, the outfit went on maneuvers in Louisiana. And we were called back to our base at Savannah about September, I guess, of 1941. And we packed our belongings and all the possessions of the squadron, and we were moved across this great land of ours from Savannah, Georgia, by train, a sleeper train, to San Francisco, and that we was loaded on a ship, passenger ship. And most of us, I guess, at least my buddies, most of us were just privates at that time. But anyway, we got back to the base, though, off of maneuvers, and I had a girlfriend who I graduated from high school with, in nursing school, and I wrote her a letter. And I told her that I had, my outfit was assigned to oversee foreign service, and that it was customary at that time that military men wouldn't rotate back to the States for the end of 2 years. But I said the war clouds are brewing in Europe, and Hitler was making his march across Europe and taking over these countries, and it looked like we might be in war any time. And I told her to forget about me and find somebody else that I might not get back. Of course, I didn't mean any of that. I guess I was playing on her heartstrings, you know. But anyway, we sailed from San Francisco on November the 1st of 1941 and arrived in Manila, Philippine Islands on November the 20th. It took us 20 days to cross the Pacific. And we were made a provisional entryman outfit, and we didn't have any infantry basic training or anything. All the basic training we had was about 3 weeks up at Chanute Field, Illinois, in which we learned military courtesy and how to march and make up our bunks and keep our personal things. So we didn't have any experience as infantrymen. All the squadrons went up on the front line except the 16th Squadron, which was my squadron, and they kept us back on an airfield that the Corps of Engineers had made hurriedly, and I was assigned then to a 50 caliber machine gun pit to man a machine gun, me and another guy, and. So when the Japs would bomb with their dive bombers, we'd watch them until they were coming down, and then we learned when to know that they'd drop their bombs, because they'd pull out of a dive, and we got to where we could see these bombs glistening up there in the sunlight, you know, coming down, and then we'd duck down below the level of the ground. This pit was about 2.5, 3 feet deep. And it was on a tripod similar to this tripod, and it would rotate 360 degrees, you know. And that was my job on Bataan. Well, of course I had several buddies that I enjoyed, and before we went to the Philippines, and afterwards, a boy named Charles Watson was a friend of mine, and we were on the death march now. It was after we surrendered. And of course that death march is a terrible thing, and it's really almost indescribable, you know, because we were, well, in the battle, about January, our rations were cut in half. We had 50% ration cut. And then about the 1st of March, or early part of March, that was cut to half. which meant that we got about a quarter of a normal ration of food. And it wasn't a balanced diet. It was C rations, but after we were surrendered, well, before we surrendered, as I say, our rations cut twice, and we had lost weight, you know, and some had malaria fever, and we weren't, to say the least, we weren't in good shape, you know. And we started on that march, and the Japs had lined us up, and where I was, we'd evacuated on down to the tip of the peninsula before the surrender. And so it was hot and dry weather, and, you know, marching the road, they lined us up in columns of fours and started marching us north, and we didn't know where we were going. And so the road got real dusty. In fact, I remember looking way ahead down the road, straight stretch of road in level ground. You could just see them. It looked like a kind of a brown fog, you know, along the road where the marchers were. And that was the kind of conditions we're in. Well, the Japs wouldn't give us any water. Very little water did they let us have, but we got into an area of land that was flat. Had flat topography, and we'd pass by every once in a while what we called the word don't come to me now, but it was overflowing water. Pipes would come up out of the ground and would crook over, and just free water just flowed all the time. And the Japs wouldn't let us go to that place and get water, but the guys were so thirsty they'd just break like wild cattle and run their whatever they had to catch water in, you know, to get a drink of water. And the Japs would shoot in there. They'd kill one or two or three. And we'd get back on the road. Of course, we were right beside the road. And so it got to where I got real low, and I just couldn't walk. And there's one day that I don't remember anything. And this Charles Watson, and he and another guy. He lived in Louisiana, named Como. He was a Cajun boy, French boy, and they kept me walking, you know, kept me from buckling down, and they just sort of carried my weight, and I just stumbled along with them, you know, in formation. Because if you fell out by the side, the Japs would just run a bayonet through you or shoot you and let you lay there. They didn't care. Just didn't, you know. Nothing got in their way. And so I guess Watson and Como was the two that I really think about, maybe more than the others, because they helped me get through that thing. And I was on that death march about, I'd say, 6 days. I don't remember one day in there. And, well, there's about 12,000 troops, American troops on Bataan. And of course, a lot of them are killed and a lot of them are died along in this death march. But there's several thousand of us there, and the only source of water he had in the area that I was in was one water spigot. And we'd line up, and you might stay in that line all day before you got to the water spigot. And you'd get you a cup of water or a canteen of water. And most of the times there at the beginning, we'd go back and get the tail end of the line, you know, and stay another day in that line and get you some more water. And they fed us real lightly. They had rice that was cooked in great big metal
Cauldron.
yeah, cauldrons. And it was real thin water, you know. It could pour like soup, you know. It wasn't dry cooked rice. And, well, different diseases broke out. I didn't think a whole lot about death, you know. But I was concerned about keep going, you know, keep going wherever we're going. But this one particular day, I don't know what time of the morning it might have been, or up in the day, but I just, everything just faded out, you know, got dizzy, and I guess I fainted, and probably, partially was a heat stroke maybe, I don't know. And I don't remember that period of time, but I do remember afterward that, you know, I could see what was going on. I kind of come back to myself. And I don't know why. But I tell you what, Gabe, the human body can withstand more than you realize. And I'll talk about some of the things maybe a little bit later here. But just like that death march, you know, you've got a choice of keep going, or you had the choice of quitting and getting shot, one of the two. And as long as you've got life, you've got hope. If you lose hope, that's the end. You die. You think about that. If you have no hope, that's the end of you. And I've had a lot of buddies. I say a lot. A few of my buddies that died in camp was because they got down sick. They could hardly walk, or some of them couldn't walk, and go after their food at food time. I'd take their musket to the kitchen area where it was issued and get mine and his and bring his back, and well, I'd bring them both back, and I'd eat mine, and I'd try to get him to eat it. He wouldn't eat, you know. He just half out of it. Well, if he didn't eat it, I'd eat it myself. And so the guys that we might lay down at night and go to sleep, and the next morning your buddy or somebody, whoever's laying alongside you here, was dead. And I could tell a day or two before that he's going to die, because he wouldn't eat his food, he wouldn't try to do anything, and you'd talk to him, tried to encourage him, but he just wouldn't rally to it. And while he had given up hope, you know, and he died. I was in Cabana 1 prison about 3 weeks when the Jap soldiers or guards come in there, and they took out 300 men, a detail of 300 men. And I didn't have anything but what I had on. And I did have maybe a few personal items that I'd held on to. But we thought, I guess, that we was going to go on a hauling detail locally, you know, maybe bring rice into the camp or whatever. It was about a 3-day trip, I guess, and all, most of it walking. And they marched us over a range of mountains. And there's 2 or 3 guys that just passed out up on a mountain trail, and I don't know what happened to them. They left them laying on the side of the road. And we marched all day the next day down into a valley, and they stopped us, and we were camped or bivouacked into No River bottom area. And the purpose of this detail was to build a road from one side of the island to another. It was a thin, the island has got narrow down there, and the Japs wanted to build a road from the east coast of that island over here to the west coast, which was probably 3 miles or 4. And that was our duty there. Well, most of us, when we got there, we weren't ready to work hardly. We went out to work, but I worked about 2 or 3 weeks. And I was down and I couldn't go to work. So I stayed in camp. And anyway, they loaded us, about 35 of us, onto a truck and hauled us to Manila, Bilibid Prison, which was an old walled-in area of the city of Manila, and it was used for a prison camp. And of course, the Japs converted that to a prisoner of war camp. And it was under the direction of American doctors, under the Japanese, of course. And these doctors had some medicine, like sulfa drugs and limited amounts of quinine for malaria and whatnot. And the food was more plentiful. And I was there about 3 weeks, and I got on my feet where I could, I got mobile, and so I was sent with a group by train up to the central part of the island of Luzon to Cabanatuan prison. In camp number 1 there. They had 3 camps in that place, but I never was but in camp number 1. And our job there was to go on details, usually kitchen detail, the barrel detail. We buried a lot of men every day. And one group would go out and dig a grave, and the others would, they had an area, the hospital area. Now, this wasn't a hospital, but it was called the hospital. And then it was divided in 2 areas. The other area was the 0 ward, we called it. And they sent guys over there that looked like they wasn't going to be able to make it, So the barrel detail would go over there, and there's a stack of matted doors, about the size of a front door there, was matted, built with bamboo strips. And then bamboo canes about that big. There'd be a pile of them over here, and all that stack of what we call doors. And they lined up in groups of 4s out there. The Japs told us to get in groups of 4. And so that 4 would go into the building and get a body and lay it on this door slat. And one end was a bamboo pole, and the other end's a bamboo pole. And there's a man at one at each corner, and they lifted it up, and they'd carry it out, and the next guy 4, the next 4. Well, they lined up down through there, and of course I was hanging back, thinking, well, maybe they won't need me. And so first, suddenly, the Japs started cutting up around there, and one slapped me upside the face and told me to get in there. Well, there's 3 other guys there the same way. And I was a medium height fella, and one guy was taller than I, and there's a short guy. Well, there's one body left in there, and it was humongous. It was just bloated and big. So I soon saw that these guys hastened in there and got a body. They was getting the smallest one, And that biggest one was left, for somebody else, and that was ours. They were carried in that fashion about a half a mile to a burial ground. And we'd put these bodies, they were disrobed, clothes taken off of them, and maybe somebody else could use it, And they were just stacked in that hole like cordwood, get it almost level with the ground, and then they'd pile dirt over that. Well, rainy season came, and that was such a stinking place. Lord, it was rotten. And but that was the worst detail I guess I was ever on for a short period of time, On the 20th of November, they came in there and lined us up in columns of fours, 750 of us. And they put a rope around the outside man, a half hitch on his arm, and that rope ran around a group of 100. So in these groups of 100, we marched down about 3 or 4 miles, about 3 miles, I guess, to the dock. And we were loaded on a Japanese freighter. And we were on that thing. Well, they changed us after about 10 days, they changed us over to another one, right down on the bottom floor of that thing. And of course, by that time, we were starved down again, And they gave us very little food on the boat, very little water. So about 4:30 one afternoon on September the 7th, 44, this thing exploded. And there's 82 of us managed to get out of that boat, get on the water, and swam to land about 2.5 miles distant. And we were gathered up by natives. And it was an area that the natives, underground forces, were in control. It was rugged, mountainous terrain, and wasn't any cities in there or anything of value to the Japs. So they just didn't come in and occupy that little old place there. And so we were, that's the thing that I was going to tell you about, that the human body can do a lot and take a lot more than anybody can imagine, probably. Is that there we were in a starved down condition, underweight, yet we were able to negotiate 2.5 miles in that water to land. And you tell me how we done that. We were with the guerrillas there about 3 weeks, and they had a radio communication way up in the mountains at their headquarters. And they radioed out to Allied forces, these survivors. And they in turn got in touch with another submarine that was operating in that area and had them to pick us up and bring out as many as they could. So we got orders one day to be up 20 kilometers up the beach from where we were by 6 o'clock that evening. Well, we went up there and we were told that a submarine was due to come in that night and carry out as many as they could. And they had us to draw numbers, the senior officers, from 1 to 82. One boy, 1 to 81. One boy volunteered he was a radio operator, and he volunteered to stay with them and help them in their communications. And so I drew number 72, and I just knew they couldn't carry out 72 on a submarine, But about 9 o'clock that night, way out 300 or 400 yards, here this submarine surfaced on the water. In a few minutes, here come a couple of guys rowing over to a rubberized boat over to the beach we were on. And one of them stepped out and asked how many there were. And the senior officer said 81. And he flashed a light out to the sub, and they flashed back, and he turned around and said, well, we'll take every one of you. And so the natives, it was supposed to have been a secret mission in there, but these natives had gathered in there by the hundreds, looking for that submarine. In fact, the skipper told us later that he come in there and saw all that, and they had bonfires built. And he saw all that, and he didn't know whether to come in or not, and finally decided that that's where we were. So they, in these native boats, they rowed us out there, and we were loaded inside that submarine. And we took off, and after 5 days and nights, we rounded up at Hollandia, New Guinea. There's a naval base there. Well, when we drove up and I got about opening the front gate, I saw my mother coming down the hall. The kitchen was back on the far end, and she come out of the kitchen. wiping her hands on the apron to see who'd driven up. She got out on the front porch and she saw me, and we met about halfway between the gate and the porch, and before she ever touched me, she prayed the most beautiful prayer of thanksgiving I've ever heard, then or since. It seemed like there was a halo about her head. That was a great homecoming. And, well, Maxine was stationed at Bible Air Force Base. So I believe it was a day or two later that she got a 7-day leave to come home. And she was coming from Memphis on the Rock Island Rocket that used to go through here from the East Coast to the West Coast. And her sister and her got together we'd pick her up at Little Rock. I don't know why they did that, because 20 minutes later she'd have been in Malvern, you know. But we enjoyed that. And so at 5 o'clock that afternoon, we were married. I hadn't seen her in 4 years. So that was a great homecoming. America is the greatest place on earth for human beings. We enjoy freedom to do what we want to do, as long as it don't prohibit other people from doing what they want to do. We have freedom of speech. We can talk about the government or anything or anybody. We have that privilege, and we have the privilege of getting an education, learning to do something and make a contribution to the world in which we live. Those people then would not recognize our way at all. I make talks over here at usually the 5th and 6th grade history class once a year. And I tell them to honor the country and look up to it and help support it, and go to school and get a good as best education they can get, and prepare themselves for their life and their living. And I guess if I've had my life to live over, I don't suppose I'd change a thing about it, even though there's a time it was rough.
Well, we were in a mop, what we call mop-up, behind General Patton's army. And we had some German troops come down out of the Alps mountains that would come and surrender to us. And they'd come and hold their hands up, and some of them with the pistols too, and their pistols, or they called them, I forget now what they called them, and in their hands, and with their hands up. You didn't know the minute they'd let their hands down and it would shoot you. And that was really scary. And first thing we'd do is tell them, get down. And they knew what that was. Just give them the signal to sit and get down. And, or drop your weapons. You know. Avec, we had a little bit of German that we could speak. And they dropped them. They said, we heard the war was over, we want to be taken prisoner. Well, you didn't take him prisoner. You marched him down to the provost marshal. You knew where he was at. And if you took him prisoner, he got part of your rations. And our rations were really short. You know, when you had to live on Spam for a month and a half, that's short ration. And so, I had one come to me and raised his hands that way, and he had a Lubker, and I took it away from him. First I had him throw it down, then I made him face down, and I got the Lubker and all the weapons they used off him, and then I told him he could stand up, and he marched in front of me, I had these Luger. And marched him to the provost marshal, and from there on the MPs took over, the military police. But that was scary. That was one scary thing.
No.
I never did kill anybody that I know of, unless it was done, unless somebody got killed by us shooting barrages over a bridge or something, with a 30 caliber or M1 or the BAR. And if I killed anybody, I don't know. But that was scary. One of my grandkids asked me, were you in combat, Grandpa? And I said, yeah. And he said, were you scared? And I said, yeah. I said, just feel my knees are still shaking. He looked at me, poor kid. I shouldn't have never said that to him. But anyway. We knew what we were fighting for. We were fighting for first of all, for our life. We were, like I said, all of us were scared. Nobody ever goes to the front line but he meets hell. And I knew what we were fighting for. We were fighting for our freedom here in the United States, for our people, for our country. Yeah. So we all knew that. And then, of course, General George Patton, they called him Blood and Guts. We felt like he didn't care whether we got killed or not, so you had to look after yourself, more or less. Take your orders like you're supposed to. I was always worried about my family at home. Patton was going through Germany so fast that the mail couldn't stay up with us. And one time it was about a month and a half before I got any letters. And I was really worried. And finally, here come a pack of letters, and asking why I wasn't writing back, and wondering if I was still living or not. And it was something I couldn't help. And finally, when I did get a letter back, everything seemed to be going all right at home, which raised a lot of worries on me. And everything. I thank the good Lord every night that He seen me through that day, every night. And whether I had done the right things by my comrade, the right thing by them. You know, I was a sergeant, and I had a whole platoon to look after, and that's 40-some men. And I was lucky that I didn't have any of them to get killed. The saddest thing I seen was little children wanting food, and they'd come to our truck where we were being fed by the sergeant, mess sergeant, and they would want our coffee grounds, our potato peelings, our orange peelings, apple cores, and they'd have a little gallon bucket with them, and it looked like a little gallon bucket, and we would share with them, the kids. But we didn't know where they took them to. They probably took them to the enemy. Fed them too, I think. But so what? The little kids looked at it like they were starved to death. That was the most. And then too, we were liberating a prison where there's prisoners in there that were not. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
They were not the Germans. They were political prisoners. And when we liberated the prison, they were just had kimonos on. And here it was, just in the middle of the winter. They had these long kimonos on with stripes up and down, and you could see their faces were just starving to death. So there was a lot of horses that had been wounded by shrapnel out in there. So we turned them loose. There was a town that's close by, so we turned them loose on the town, and went in there and shot those horses and told them to help themselves. And they would come out there with big knives and cut steaks off of them horses, and just practically eat it raw. I've never seen anything like it. Well, the only thing we were told is what we read on the bulletin board by Patton and Eisenhower, that if you haven't seen the destruction at Dachau concentration camp, we are allowing you to draw a truck from the motor pool, and as many of you wants to go that don't have any duty to go be a witness to what went on at the Dachau concentration camp. Well, we knew that we had read in the Stars and Stripes that about the atrocities that were there, but we did not expect to see piles of bodies there. And the description of it was meager on the bulletin board. And when I thought at that time that it would be historical. And I brought a camera along with me that I had liberated from one of the towns that we had secured. And it had film in it and all, but before we got there, the smell began to get so putrid. If you've ever smelled dead fish, the body smells worse than dead fish, dead body. Well, anyway, when we got closer and closer to it, the stench was so bad. We had to wet handkerchiefs and put them over our noses. We weren't allowed to bring any, or they didn't have any gas masks for us to take with us. And when we got off of the truck, he let down, the sergeant says, okay, we're here. He let the gate down, and we climbed out of them trucks. But before we got there, we had to put handkerchiefs, wet in water, over our noses in order to breathe. And when he let down that gate, one of them boys went to throwing up. He just gagged. And he looked over there across the fence, and we seen these piles of bodies. It looked like cordwood out there, but they were head stacked, ready to cord, and there was, if I remember, there was 5 stacks out there, and they were all stacked 6 foot high and I'm making an approximation, and 15 foot long. And one of them was, one stack though was clothing that had all the linings ripped out of them. Wherever there was a pocket, it was all turned inside out, and the shoes were knocked out, and the soles were looked at, and we assumed that they were looking for valuables. And then we turned over to where the bodies were stacked. The first thing I noticed was the bodies were so contorted and just mangled, you know, and every one of them that had gold teeth, I guess, had their jaws broken and the teeth pulled out, I guess, because that's the way it looked to me. You know. And then I noticed some of the German soldiers had wheelbarrows and wheeling the bodies out. And then I noticed some of them were still living, alive, walking around in kimonos with stripes up and down and wooden shoes. And that's all they had on. And then here it was, we had our winter clothes on. And they all, you look at them and all they could do was just stare straight ahead when they were walking. They didn't look either way. And we noticed that one of the piles of bodies didn't have tattoo mark on the arm. That was the tattoo we knew was a Jewish body. And there was 2 piles of them. There was women and children. I'm sure there must have been children there because it was small bodies. And there were one stack didn't have any tattoos on them at all, and that was the smaller stack. It wasn't as large as the Jewish stack, and we assumed that they were political prisoners. So the blast furnace was going full blast, and we had a German interpreter, and he talked to the German, and he says he was left behind to bury the bodies and get them buried as fast as they could, because the United States Army was right behind them. And that's what we seen. And those bodies were there for maybe 5 days, 5-6 days. Just bloated, and oh man. I got so mad about it that when I got to my truck, I told the boys I'm going to go in there and shoot the heck out of some of them Germans. And they just begged me not to. They said, "You just make things worse. Sarge, you better get on this truck." And so I did that, but nobody talked all the way back to where we were camped. The stillness was gone, and finally took the handkerchiefs off from their faces, and they just stared in space. I guess I did the same thing. I did. I had to hide a lot. I was afraid to be labeled, in World War II they called it shell shock. You know, a little bit nutty or crazy. And I didn't want that to be hanging on me because I was really wanting to get a job, you know. I wanted to get a job as quick as I could. I was about to go back to carpenter work, which I did before I went into the service. And I didn't speak about it at all, although my wife knew there was something wrong because she'd say I'd get up in the middle of the night and scream out and say, no, no. Well, we left the harbor, France, and there was 13 decks on the ship we came back on, and one deck of it was off limits because there was wax in there. They didn't want no soldiers messing around there at all. And anyway, we came. The ride back was kind of rough. I had a bunk bed and it rolled me from side to side, but I didn't get seasick because I was allowed to go up on deck, and I'd go up on deck, and then pretty soon, after a couple of days out on the water, we seen whales or porpoises and head of the ship were going up and down like fish do. And another 2 days where pretty soon somebody out on the deck hollered, land, land. You could hear them up on the deck hollering. And pretty soon the captain came on the loudspeaker. We are now approaching land, and it'll be another 3 hours before we're in port. And everybody got up and went to their windows or outlooks and went to the deck, top deck, and sure enough, there was a Statue of Liberty. What a sight. But she was 30 miles away yet. And we just stayed there, and we just were so glad to see that statue. We hugged one another. You know, if you don't think men had tears in their eyes or men don't cry, you could see it. And when we got to inside the harbor, there were a bunch of boats met us out there. Two of them were guard boats on each side of the ship, and then there was other boats that were fire boats. And I guess there was 10 or 12 boats out there come to greet us and blaring at their bullhorns. Job well done. Welcome home, and blowing their horns and shooting water all up in the air. And then closer to the deck, there was the boats that were guiding us in had dancing girls on it, and on both sides of the boat, and they're also saying, welcome home, and job well done. And we got closer to the Statue of Liberty, and it was like when I left, same way. I hated to see the statue disappear, but this time it was right up close to it, and then could see everything. But a lot of the boys were interested in the girls too, watching them dance. But I was more interested in that statue getting home. And soon they said in an hour we should be in port. When we got off of that gangplank, I was one of the first to get off. I was so anxious to get off. And I knelt down and kissed the ground. I was so happy to get home. I had kept still, didn't want nobody to know how I felt for years, practically all through time I worked and made a living for my family. And I didn't realize that the younger generation didn't know anything much about what happened in World War II until Frida and I was in a parade down here in Conway, and I had my cap on. I was a commander of the WW, and I wore that cap and go get it for him. And when I seen those little kids just so high, I'd salute them and they'd salute me back, and you could see the expression in their face how happy they were. I decided then that these children and younger people needed to know just what happened in World War II. And I opened up and started telling. And that was some years ago now. And my words to them would be, always remember, if you will, that what we have done, what we have gone through for our independence here in this country. And we all, I love this country, and you all should love it too, because you are living in the best country in the world. And I'm proud to be an American.
I was first educated in the normal school where my sisters and brother were in the training school when I was born in 1925, became Arkansas State Teachers College that very year. So when my older sister, who was a mathematician and a painter, she influenced me in my painting a great deal, graduated in 29 and taught school during the Depression, and actually she was the main provider of the family. And Dr. Irby called me in one day and said, Gene, you know you're going to have to go into the Army. I would like for you to join up and go into officer training. And I said, no, sir, I will have to be drafted to go. I did not want to go. I didn't want to have anything to do with the war. I would have been a conscientious objector and gone to Canada, I guess, if I'd had a little bit more gumption. Anyway, I said, no, they'll have to draft me. So I waited around, and sure enough, the day we were drafted, we went to Camp Robinson, and they did all of these tests and, physical things, and there we were, standing naked, and at a table where there were sitting several men, and then I can remember two officers standing over by the side, and they looked at my records and said, all right, we'll put you in the Navy to go to San Diego or something. And I said, no, I do not want to go in the Navy. I want in the Army. And the officers rolled their eyes at each other and said, okay, put him in the infantry. And I had hoped to be in the Army Specialized Training Program, ASTP. And there were lots of us who wanted in that program, and a lot of boys had gotten into it. And it was special because you were given advantages, and you were kept here and trained to do something, to become a specialist, not an officer necessarily, but a special work. From Camp Robinson, after spending a little bit of time down there, I remember the first job that I had was after the exercise time. We were all lined up, and the sergeant asked, have any of you had any college training? So I raised my little old hand thinking, oh boy, I'll bet this is going to be good. And it did turn out to be good, because I got to work in the post office and sort letters and do a little bit of stuff with the mail, which got me out of a bunch of exercises and all that I didn't need or want to do anyway. When we got to the rifle range, I didn't have gumption enough to think of the future. We all had our turn shooting, and the bullseye was way out there, and you were lying down here on the ground, and all you had to do was aim and fire. And if you missed the whole thing, they waved a white flag, which was called Maggie's Drawers. And so you knew that you weren't any good. Okay, well, I didn't get any Maggie's Drawers. And lo and behold, I was one of the best ones. I had a real good marksmanship record, which, I thought, well, that's good. I guess I have a good eye. So, as it turned out, later, though, I didn't have the BAR. But over there in France and Germany, the fella, his last name was Paul. He was a tall kid that I did stay in foxholes with and slept in tents with some, was killed, and he was the BAR man, and I inherited the BAR from him. And that was heavy and getting closer and closer, to the front and all that jazz. So that was not a happy moment, and I didn't even think about it then, but later I have thought, well, if you'd been smart, you would have pretended that you couldn't see out there very well. So there were sad times. The worst one was in the Battle of the Bulge, when Paul, this boy carrying the BAR, and 3 other fellas were sent into a battle. This is in the countryside, not too far, I guess, from Biche, France or Germany, whichever one it is. I guess it's still France. Anyway, they were walking in front of a tank, and I have yet to understand why anyone would send anyone in front of the tanks, but I have read that the tanks needed protection too. Anyway, you couldn't hear anything, and they were just mowed down, 4 of them. And as a result, that's when I took over the BAR, because those 4, and that was the worst tragedy, although I'd seen other dead people in the forest. I can remember one landscape that was as bad or worse than anything in Saving Private Ryan. After the artillery had leveled all the trees, or if not, all the tops were out on, just a whole forest of tree trunks and dead Germans. But our fighting had been before that, so all we were doing was walking through this to get further on up. My war wound was actually after the battles were over. We were walking into Germany, and I didn't know it, but we were evidently not too far from Stuttgart, Germany, and I have looked on a map to see. We were headed, we presumed, toward Berlin, and we were just walking along in line along the highway on which tanks were moving too, and we were walking by, and I think this tank actually had stopped. There were trees on the left along the roadside, and in front of me was one of the older replacements, a man who had been in the war for several years, and I'm sure that he should have been replaced a long time ago and been sent back home. Anyway, it was just at sundown, and it was getting kind of twilight, dark, and boom, a grenade, an anti-tank grenade had been shot at the tank, hit a tree above us, and I assume that he fell. Just a flash, I had been hit. And I can remember saying, "Oh, Jesus." And then the next thing I knew, I was blind. And I had been hit in several places on my face, so I thought I was hit in both eyes. I could not see. So I screamed, "I'm blind, I can't see, I'm blind, I'm blind." And the sergeant wasn't far behind me. And I started walking back. He said, "This way," or something, and I started walking back. And I had dropped the BAR up there next to the tree. I didn't care. I can remember thinking, I don't care what happens to this rifle, I'm just getting away from here. So the sergeant led me back, or called a medic, and I guess the medic took me back, but the sergeant helped get me back, and I think he was wounded at the same time, the sergeant, because later in the hospital I saw him, and the boy that probably was following me was probably hit too, and they were there, but their wounds must have been less important. But I feel sure the man, the poor older man in front of us, was killed. One of the main things I disliked about the whole idea of war, and the main thing is people don't realize that it is simply pure, unadulterated chaos and mayhem. Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows, and all of the wars that have ever been fought have been people fighting over pieces of land that didn't amount to anything. Nobody could do anything with them or for them. And and there is no rhyme or reason for it. It's just pure insanity. And those who didn't die and are like me, who came home from the war wounded, and Vietnam certainly proved this, never are the same. I'm not the same person I would have been. Possibly I gained some things from it, but I'm sure that I lost a great deal too, in illusions for one thing. I would have been an entirely different person, but I would have been an entirely different person if the Depression hadn't hit too. The artist is the person who feels that he or she is presenting something that people can enjoy and use. The deciding between what is right and wrong is a part of the exercise too. Form follows function. We need something, and so we have satisfaction in knowing that we are working with the material to create something that will serve this purpose and that will work, will help people. Intelligent designers, the theory that we have become as civilized as we are through experience and hard work, tells us that the smart way of doing things, the intelligent way of putting things together, of creating form, creating unity, that's what designing is, that we teach. Taking the elements, line, shape, value, texture, and color, and putting them together into a unity which has few faults. It's as near perfect as we can make it. And this can be actual functional beauty, or it can be simply aesthetic. It looks good, it just fits together. If you take something away, it's not as good, and if you add something to it, it's unnecessary. The act of designing and using your mind, actually, most of art work is emotional. Subjectivity, the subject matter in an artwork is what it contains that satisfies, that gives the senses a good response. If it doesn't, it's considered poor design, or if it falls apart, if it doesn't work, then the form didn't work out from, it doesn't function, it's a poor design. So, to me, war is a perfect example of chaos and destruction. It's not good design, it is a design of worthlessness and mayhem. It's wicked, it's satanic. It's the negative side of life, and if we're going to promote that, or if we're going to carry it on after all these years, then peace is never going to be acquired. Wars have never, they've brought supposedly short periods of peaceful getting together, but why can't the United States wake up to the fact that if we are a success at all as a united nation, and the states have been warred over in the Civil War to make sure that we're either going to work together or we're not going to work at all. If we believe in this, why are we fighting somebody else to try to make them like us. We can't force those Iraqi people into a democracy. They don't know anything about it. The freedom to do and go anywhere you want to, and think anything you want to, and learn from varied experiences, and choose your friends, and just be free.
My name is Raymond Uhrich. I was born in Loveland, Colorado, March the 2nd, 1921. I later moved to Alliance, Nebraska when I was a baby. And I graduated from Alliance High School in 1939. Well, there were Germans from Russia, and we spoke German and English. We learned how to speak English when we went to school, and so that's why we have trouble speaking sometimes, because we get our German and our English mixed up. During the early 18th century, Catherine the Great was of German heritage, and she asked for a bunch of her people from Germany to come to Russia to live with her. And she offered land to them. And so many Germans agreed to this, thinking that they'd receive land and everything for that, but the land was just a myth. When the revolution came in the early 1900s, fortunately my mother and my future mother and father, they moved to America. She was only 14 years old, and she came into through Baltimore, and they were not going to accept her because she was sick. So a lady from Baltimore agreed to take care of her. And my father had the pink eye, and they would not let him come in until later. A simple little thing as a pink eye, which is completely different then than it is now. And so he came through Canada later on. They did not know each other in Frank, Russia, but they both landed in Loveland, Colorado, where they met and got married. But since she was only 14, and I don't know how, well, my father was a little bit older than that, but to leave your family and go to a foreign country really spoke well of their character, I think. We were just aware of it. We didn't pay attention to the war. And I did have some friends that went over there earlier than that. But my middle brother Harold was in the service right afterwards, and he was out in California. And but we never thought anything about. We knew that the Germans were wrong, and we knew the Japanese were wrong. We had no question in our minds any about German feelings. We're Americans, foremost and last, and always. I've always been interested in flying. I've done a lot of flying myself when I was a little kid. We made airplanes and all that sort of stuff. But after I was in the civil service in Washington, D.C., in the War Department, I read an article in a magazine about a navigator and the responsibilities of what a navigator has, duties and responsibilities. And that's for me. So I went back to Alliance and went to Denver, Colorado to enlist in the Army Air Force in 1942. And then went to navigation school in Hondo, Texas. And there we received my wings in December of 43. But we took a graduation flight, and we were going to California for a graduation flight, and we had an engine problem in El Paso, Texas, and so we had spent a day there to get a new engine. Then we went from El Paso, Texas to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and from Cheyenne, Wyoming to St. Louis, Missouri, and then from there down to Biloxi, Mississippi, then back to Hondo. And there were various cadets in there, and each leg the cadet had to be the pilot, well, the navigator. And mine was from Biloxi, Mississippi back home, and I did my celestial navigation on the moon, by way of the moon. And that was very difficult because it was so close to you. And so your readings had to be real, real close. And so my ETA and the time of arrival was very, very accurate, very close to what we actually did. And so that was my big thing. But well, I didn't have that opportunity to be there long enough to be nervous. I arrived there on the, I think the 14th of April, and my mission was the 24th of April of 1944. And so we were shot down on that mission, so I didn't have an opportunity even to get acquainted with the British at all. Well, at that time, as you see in the paper that we had huge formations, 200 or 300 airplanes, and so our squadron was just part of the huge armada of planes that were going over there. And so we got in position, and as we flew to Augsburg, I think that's where were hit by roughly 30 M109s, and they had several sorties through our formation, and all 4 engines were shot down, So everything went. I had an electric flying suit, which is very nice because it wasn't as cumbersome as all the leather and the furs. But when the electricity went out at that altitude, I got extremely cold very fast. And so the co-pilot was hit, and the bombardier just became scared. He was scared stiff. So I had to help him with his parachute. I hooked his parachute on his chest and shoved him out the front door, front hatch. And as I shoved him out, I pulled his ripcord. And I found out later that he spilled a chute and broke his back. But he lived through it. I heard that he was in Moosburg. That's when I learned that much later. And then the pilot helped the co-pilot out. And then I finally got out. And we were very far from the ground when my parachute opened. And that's probably one reason why I broke both ankles and had a ruptured kidney. And so, but at that time there was a little light German plane that landed right shortly after I hit, but it broke its struts, and so it couldn't take me. So we sat out there in that field about 3 or 4 hours, I believe it was, and Finally, another little plane came and picked me up. And as I was, by that time, I had kind of relaxed a little bit and could observe a little bit more, because that's been my whole life, observing things. And so when we lifted up and we started flying around, well, I noticed an airplane factory, and that I didn't know never did see on a map. So I made notice of that. So they took me to an interrogation place. I don't know where it was. And I spent, I don't remember how long, and being interrogated, because I guess they thought I knew something. And also they knew about my heritage, I think, of German and Russian. And they knew I could speak German. And so that's what they're trying to get me to say anything. But they knew what I had for breakfast that morning and everything like that. And they knew I graduated from Hondo, Texas, and they knew more about me than. So I finally told them, "You know more about me than I do," and they finally let me go, not to go, but send me to the prison camp, Stalag 3. And so at Stalag 3, well, we were always all the newcomers were interrogated by the superior officers, just to get intelligence. See, a ferret was nothing but a spy, and they had a long stick that they used to jab in the ground see if they could find tunnels, because that's what everybody was trying to do, escape. Or they looked under the barracks to see if there's any tunnels being made there, and so they'd stand around and listen to the Americans talk, and was thinking that the Americans didn't know that they understood English. Well, they didn't know that I understood German. So then what they spoke, I could relate to my superiors, the things that they spoke. So that was the interesting part of mine. Well, Stalag 3, there's been some movies made of Stalag 3. It's about 100 miles southeast of Berlin, which is probably in Poland. And there was an east, north, south, and west compounds. And one compound was mostly British, and the rest were Americans. And there were probably a total of about 10,000 airmen there. But we were really organized, because we held weekly inspections, made sure that we kept as clean as we could. We kept our uniforms as clean as we could, because my father, our parents were allowed to send a package every 2 months. I got one package in my whole time I was there. And in my package there was a pair of scissors and hand clippers, and a comb. So we spent our time cutting hair with all the fellows. And I was also the canteen officer on my compound. And we made sure that whatever we got from the Germans, we could dole it out, like razor blades and things like that. And one time we were given equivalent German pay, and we bought a carload of toilet water, a little bottle of toilet water. We had no use for it whatsoever, but it took up a carload, train car. That was one way of making them unable to use that car for military purposes. So that's how we thought. Well, our morale was very high. And since our morale is high and we're all looked after each other. And so since we were well organized, we had each building had its own so-called captain leader, and so we all made sure that we took care of each other. Now since I had the ruptured kidney and the other thing, I spent probably 3 or 4 days or a week, a month in the hospital. They have a German hospital there nearby. And I'd never get sick in the daytime. So at night they'd barricade all the windows and everything else like that, and put the dogs out. So we'd turn on the light that had to go to the hospital, and that made the guards very mad, because then they'd have to round up the dogs and take me out to the hospital. So, but I spent quite a bit of time in the hospitals. Yeah. But I think the biggest thing was our morale and how we took care of each other. Well, Stalag 3, I'll go back on that, because we had to walk from Stalag 3 in the wintertime, because the Russians were invading eastern Germany. And in January of '45, during a blizzard, we were evacuated. And they gave me a choice of either staying there and let the Russians liberate me, or I said, no, I'll take my chance. I don't want to have anything to do with the Russians. But we walked in a blizzard, and it was really bad, frostbitten feet and everything else like that. It was really bad, because the only time we could rest was sometimes just out in an open we'd rest, and then maybe once in a while they'd find us in a barn that we could sleep in for a little bit, but the barn was ice cold also. And that's where the Stalag 3 conditions at the first camp weren't too bad, but when you got to the second camp, that's where it was really bad. And the lice and no food and bombings and stuff like that, because it was too close to a railroad center, and every night we were bombed. And so there was a colonel that wrote a letter to the Germans saying that they were not adhering to the Geneva Convention, complaining about the conditions there. And but we're there a couple of months, and then the Americans were coming from the west, and so the atmosphere and the attitude of the Germans changed quite a bit, because they realized that the war was over. So they had us walk from Moosburg down to Moosburg, which is about 60-some miles, I guess. And because of the cold conditions, I guess, and walking out of Sagan, I contracted pneumonia. And there I was in a hospital in Moosburg. And I was there when Patton and his army liberated us in April 29th, 1945. Then they took me by ambulance to Reims, France. And that was there the day after they signed the treaty at Reims, France. And I spent some period of time there because I'd lost quite a bit of weight. And then after that, they took me to Le Havre, France. We spent a certain period of time there, I don't remember, building up my health and weight. And then from Reims, France, we embarked to the United States. But on the way there, we were diverted to Trinidad because there were some U-boats in the vicinity that apparently they hadn't had the word that the war was over yet. So we detoured down to Trinidad and spent a couple of days there. And then from Trinidad, then we went up to New York City. we got in there at night, and we were not the first ships that went through there. But I know that I heard a lot of the hollering and stuff like that by the guys that did see it, and because I was not able to do that celebration. Well, we had a certain period of time when we got back. We got back, I think, in June of '45, so we had 4 or 5 months at home to get acclimated and reacclimated. And I was very fortunate. I guess fortunate or unfortunate, depends upon how you want to look at it, because I didn't have that battle experience like a lot of others did. And so that's why I could acclimate lots easier, I think, than some of them did. Well, I think just like all wars, most of them are economic wars, and we felt we're fighting on the right side. We didn't. Hitler was he was just a devil in disguise. We had no animosity as such against the German people, only he and his cohorts like Goebel and all those people. And that even though you have a different heritage of the civil, like the Japanese heritage, of German heritage, you live in America.
See, I joined the service for patriotic reasons.
Well, the freedom and liberties that you have, and the choices that you can move throughout this whole country without worrying. Whereas over there, you can't do that at all. You have all the liberties in the world, all the opportunity to do what you want to, and make anything you want to of yourself.